Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. We have a really large group of people here who've joined us on this beautiful Friday morning in Los Angeles. Thanks so much for joining us for today's Japan House Los Angeles live discussion. My name is Mark Frauenfelder. I'm a research director at Institute for the Future. I'm the founding editor of Wired.com. I'm the co-founder of Boing Boing. I'm going to be your host and moderator today. The event today focuses on how Japanese-style business culture applies to the new business normal. We'll have a Q&A discussion, and we're going to learn insights into Japanese culture through the lens of business communications. We'll also cover how Japanese etiquette practices can benefit today's increasingly prevalent virtual meetings. I'm honored to be joined today by Yuko Kaifu, the president of Japan House Los Angeles, the Japanese cultural destination in the heart of Hollywood. Kaifu-san is a former foreign services officer who honed her Japanese etiquette skills and knowledge through her work as an official interpreter for the Japanese Imperial Family, Prime Minister and Foreign Minister for their meetings with foreign dignitaries, including President Ronald Reagan and President George H.W. Bush. Previously, Kaifu-san was managing director in the corporate communications department at MUFG Union Bank, where she was charged with media relations and corporate social responsibility activities for the Japanese and Japanese American communities, in addition to US-Japan relations. She also served as consul at the Consulate General of Japan in Los Angeles and as vice president of the Japanese American National Museum. Please welcome Yuko Kaifu. Hi, Kaifu-san.
Hello, Mark. Thank you so much for having me today.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, as we are all going through the same horrible experience of the corona pandemic, we are very much hopeful that we will go back to normal soon as we can, but it will not be the old normal anymore. It will be a new normal, including how we do business, how we do communicate with people, particularly from different cultures and different countries. And today I would be delighted to share my own experiences and perspectives as to how we have been doing, how we are trying to adapt to the new reality of the world. So as Mark, you kindly said, Japan House is a cultural destination and public diplomacy initiative launched by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. We are the only one in 3 locations in the world alongside Sao Paulo and London. We're based in Hollywood. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we're currently closed, but we are there to showcase various aspects of Japan, and it's a great honor and pleasure to showcase business practices and business culture that is in Japan and from Japan. So we do have a lot of online programming on the website, so I hope that you would visit there later. But without further ado, Mark, do you want to start?
Absolutely, yes. I am so looking forward to this pandemic being over, because Japan House LA is just such a treasure. I've been there many times. It's wonderful. Also, but I do agree, your online events have been really great. The recipe for making a rice dish was really great. I really enjoyed that a lot. But on to today's topic. Before we start the Q&A, I'd like to let attendees know that we've already incorporated some of the questions you submitted prior to the chat we're going to have. But we welcome you to submit questions as we go along. There's a Q&A box you can click on. We'll try to answer some of those questions throughout the chat. We apologize in advance if we don't get to all of your questions.
Well, thank you, Mark. I also want to note that we are recording today's conversation with Mark, and we'll be posting our video on our website, japanhousela.com. And we also have social at Japan House LA on Facebook and Instagram, as well as at JH Los Angeles on Twitter for updates. So please visit there as well.
All right, so are we ready to get started?
Of course.
Okay, great. So Kaifu-san, I recently read a National Geographic article about no-touch greetings, and COVID-19 obviously is influencing the way that people are connecting. You know, elbow bumps, no handshakes, and things like that. But some cultures already traditionally have no contact greetings, such as Japanese bowing. And this made me think about how we could take cues from different cultures and business practices and apply them to new ways of doing business in this new normal, as you say that we're in. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about traditional Japanese style ways of doing business, how they might apply to today's virtual meeting. You know, for example, how do you bow in a virtual meeting? Mm-hmm. Is it possible or important to simulate a bow when you're seated?
Well, first of all, Mark, thank you so much for reading the article on National Geography. When the author reached out to me and asked me that she wants to interview me about the Japanese practice of bowing, I never thought of potential of bowing might become a universal or more commonly shared practice of greeting. As you know, we Japanese don't shake hands much, I mean, among ourselves. We don't hug, except for among very close friends or relatives or family, and kisses either. So usually we do express our greeting by bowing, and it's a different degree of bowing when you meet a person in person. If it's just a light greeting, you bow 15 degrees, perhaps like this, and then 30 when you show respect, and then 45 degrees when you really show your respect or sorrow or appreciation. You really mean deeply something. Then you bow 45 degrees. Now on virtual meetings, it's very hard. I mean, it comes naturally when I attend virtual meetings with my Japanese counterparts, Japanese people. I bow like this, but if you bow too deeply, you lose myself on the screen. So I don't recommend doing that. But then it just comes naturally, like it's almost like nodding plus.
Sure. Is it ever appropriate to actually stand up out of your seat to bow, or is it always okay to stay in your seat, even to like a boss or something? Okay.
I've never seen people standing up and bow deeply. You don't need to do that. And, okay. And also, shaking hands used to become more common practice among even Japanese, particularly when they meet with Americans or people from different cultures. They used to get to do handshaking as well. Now, of course, it's not done under the new
right.
Right? Particularly on virtual conferences, people do wave like this.
Sure.
Right.
It's interesting, and I see more and more of that waving, and I think we are seeing this world where handshakes could possibly be a thing of the past, so that not only virtual meetings will find a substitute for contact greetings, but we will have no contact greetings in the real world from now on as part of the new normal.
And when I came to think about bowing, it's a gracious way of greeting, right? Because I don't necessarily want to do air high five. I don't necessarily want to do what you call foot bumps or elbow touching, particularly in the business setting. So bowing could really be an alternative to all those that have been practiced here.
Yeah. So let's move on a little bit to the topic of virtual meetings and kind of the history of them. I remember in the mid 80s, I was a mechanical engineer working for a company that was owned by Fujitsu. And we occasionally would have meetings with Fujitsu, and when they were really important, super important, then I would fly to Yokohama to Fujitsu headquarters. But then for fairly important meetings, I would actually fly from Colorado to Silicon Valley to Fujitsu America headquarters, where they had a dedicated teleconference line set up so that we could have a virtual meeting with our Japanese counterparts and colleagues in Yokohama. And it was like a big deal, very expensive for the line and everything, but it was cheaper than flying there. So virtual meetings have been around, on a small level, but how prevalent in your experience were virtual meetings prior to the pandemic?
Well, thank you for the question, Mark. Companies like Fujitsu, of course, have been way ahead of other more low-tech companies or small or medium companies. It's been virtual conferencing system have been there. And in my own experience, I've used the system since about 10 years ago or so, but then it was almost always in a group setting. So you gather up in person as a group, and then when you're communicating with your Japanese counterpart, they're there as a group. So although it covered a huge area or across the Pacific Ocean, it was almost like the combination or hybrid of in-person and digital virtual. Now it became so much different now because of the telecommuting. Because when you do virtual meeting, you almost always do sign up individually. So it's a different setup of the system. Let me just talk about the telecommuting or telework, as they call it in Japan, how they have been doing in more recent months after the pandemic. According to the survey done by the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, back in 2017, 13.9% of the companies introduced some style of teleworking, telecommuting. In 2018, it was 19.1%. And as of April 2020, it increased to 27.9%. But it's nationwide. In metropolitan Tokyo is even more drastic. The government, the metropolitan Tokyo government interviewed or surveyed companies with more than 30 employees. As of March this year, 24% of the companies had introduced some style of telework. The number shot up to 64%. So it's a huge jump in terms of the work style. Many companies are still and also expressing that they will continue on with this modality of work style even after the pandemic is over. 90% of major 130 companies, major companies, as was interviewed by Tokyo Japan Business News, said that 90% of them said that they would like to continue with this type of teleworking style, including Fujitsu.
A new normal indeed. Things have really changed. And I just remember my experiences in the Fujitsu offices in Yokohama, watching how meetings were conducted. It was quite different. The engineers in the office setting was interesting. There was a long table where engineers were sitting side by side along this long table, and then the boss would sit at the end of the table. And when one of the engineers had a call with a vendor or another company or something, they would pick up the phone, and the boss would pick up the phone and listen to the conversation. And if he heard something that the other party was saying and he didn't want his employee to answer, he'd go like this. Of course, that's kind of different now because everything's on video. You can see, maybe you could just talk a little bit about the typical format of a group meeting in Japan and how this can translate into a virtual meeting.
Certainly. When you have in-person meetings or conferences in Japan, it's more or less more structured and organized. As you said, that there is a huge table, and one side will be sat by your group of people, with your most senior executive sitting perhaps at the center of the line. if you travel to Japan and participate in such a meeting, you'll be asked to sit on the other side of the table and in accordance with the protocol order, the hierarchy of the offices. And someone would, of course, chair the meeting, and then it's kind of, you start with the business card exchange, and then you usually look at your senior most executive to speak. And only when this person appoints someone else to speak, they stay quiet. And that's the traditional way of carrying out business. And perhaps towards the end of the meeting, depending upon the kind of situation, you might want to take a group photo, you might want to exchange some gifts. And that's the most conservative form. There are lots of other companies that newly emerging entrepreneurial type of companies that don't follow that kind of conservative way of format, but that's the way that has been done in person. Now, as you said, years back, there were some companies that introduced virtual meeting style, but then it was because it was done by groups. Like once your group of people are sitting in the same room, whereas you'd be facing with a group of other companies' people. So it was almost like the same, except that you can't exchange cards, you can't exchange gifts. But then in terms of the atmosphere, because you're part of the group, you're part of, you can follow your protocol, whatever, on your side. But now, because it's done, you sign up, you sign in individually, and you see whole lots of people. If it's a Zoom meeting, you can see icons of everybody's face, which makes people very nervous. And I'm glad that I don't have to see all the faces of the audience. I see you, Mark, only you. But if I could get to see the faces of everyone in the room, probably I would be rather nervous. So that's one thing, and I'd like to talk a little bit about how difficult it could be to adapt to the new format of virtual meeting, particularly when you do individual sign in. Because if I can go on to that, there are a few elements to it, I think. One is, of course, the language issue. You ought to remember that for the vast majority of Japanese, if they're participating from Japan, speaking in English, they are speaking in a foreign language. No matter how good they may be, it's still a foreign language. So that's one thing that makes you feel a little bit hesitant to raise your hand and voice your opinions. Second is the technical part of it. Although, as we said, there are some companies who introduced a virtual conferencing system a long time ago. The new system, like Zoom, is pretty new. And they don't know how to utilize it necessarily. J.D. Power conducted a bilateral the survey, both in Japan and the United States, in terms of the use of this virtual meeting. And of all these questioned in Japan who've been already using this virtual meeting system in one way or another as of April this year, 61% said that they started to use this virtual meeting modality since February this year. So it means that it's still quite new. And in response to the question as to whether or not it was hard for them to operate the system, like video on, mute, unmute, all these things that you can get used to it. And once you get used to it, it becomes rather easy. Share your screen, materials, and things like that. Many 20% of Japanese respondents said it was either extremely difficult or rather difficult. Whereas Americans said only 6% of American respondents said that it was either very difficult or rather difficult. So there is a gap in terms of getting used to the new system. So you have to appreciate that part of it. Now, the third is the cultural difference. Of course, Japan and the United States have nurtured different types of different cultures, different values, and public speech has never been emphasized in the traditional educational system. When I came here almost 20 years ago with my family, my children were put into daycare or elementary school. My son was the second grader at elementary school. And he came back and said, well, what is this one called show and tell? Show and tell, you can be any topic, anything that the children bring in and talk about it, right? So from a very young age, they are trained to do public speaking. In Japan, I've never remembered doing such a thing, except that you do group work and you do presentation, that's all right. But then not necessarily specifically how to speak in public was part of the educational system. Now they're changing it, and they're supposed to introduce this active learning curriculum so that it's not just one-way flow of teaching, like from the teachers to students, students take note and then take exams. That used to be a typical way of carrying out classwork. But they recognize that they should be more engaged in active conversation, discussion amongst pupils, among also with teachers. So they're introducing this new curriculum of active learning. And I hope that it would change and improve the public speech capability of Japanese. And of course, silence has been regarded as gold, eloquence is silver. So that part of the value system is still there as well.
Very interesting. Along this lines of cultures coming into contact with each other and how they might communicate, we have a question from our one of our viewers right now. Steve is his name. It's a good question, I think. He asked, do you think different greetings, such as waves and bows, will become equally received so that one could bow and the other could wave without either feeling awkward? What are your thoughts on this, Kaifu-san?
That is quite acceptable. And in many cases, as per my experience, we do both. Bow, and when we recognize someone else is waving, I wave back. So, and it's a great melting ice, like breaking ice kind of thing, like a smile and, oh, you're bowing, and so I bow, or you're waving, I wave as well. So it's a little bit of unspoken interchanges of greetings.
I love that. Here's another question I have that's kind of from direct experience of when we would have when I was working as an engineer and had a formal meeting with our Japanese colleagues, we learned that kind of introducing new kind of surprising or controversial information was not received particularly well, and it could be thought of as almost not insulting, but just like why didn't we discuss this prior to the meeting, kind of. So first of all, I'd like to just see if that's typical, or if this was something that's not typical in meetings in Japan, and also what is the best way to kind of convey new controversial information during a virtual meeting?
I thank you for the great question. I think that no one appreciates surprise, right? And particularly because people sign in individually, there's no prior discussion among themselves. If they are brought up, if they are shown or presented with a completely new idea or controversial subject matter, how could they possibly move forward in a constructive way? Is there, I guess that they might not have been upset, but they might have been in a state of shock as to how should we proceed. So in order to avoid that, I think that nemawashi or preparation is very much important. So I suggest that you communicate well by email or by phone, among your key contacts, and set up the agenda. And then as much as possible, talk about those points that you want to discuss really deeply. So that, see, Japanese society traditionally is a consensus building society. So even when you're top of the organization, you treasure tapping in, getting insights or suggestions or opinions from your colleagues or your staff. And without that process, it makes it rather difficult to conduct productive meetings. So, and it's the same thing about business card exchanges, because we don't do that. We can't do that anymore. It's best to kind of list up all the attendees' names and affiliations, and so that people know exactly who they are, that they're seeing the faces of.
Right. Yes. It was that was something that was really helpful to me in the meetings, was just laying out the business cards in front of me, kind of in order of the folks across the row, so I could just quickly remember who was who. It was really helpful for me.
Right. Exactly. And business card is like part of you. So you receive it respectfully, you look at it, and then respectfully handle it and place it in front of you, in front of you on the table. But that of course cannot be done. So in lieu of business card exchanges, I suggest that the distribution of the names of people in advance would be very helpful, because you want to know who they are that you're seeing the faces of.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So another question about virtual meetings. How important is it to begin with small talk, or is it better to just get right into it and delve into the matter at hand?
I think that it's always helpful to start with the small talks, because they're nervous, right? You and I, Mark, talked to each other before this session started, and it already softened our atmosphere. I mean, I've known you, but still it helped. And it's the same thing. Although I don't recommend that you, thinking that your partners, your other people may not be fluent in English, I would recommend that you start with something simple, understandable, and also talking about the language issue that I was talking about earlier. It might be good to have someone who can translate, who can interpret, depending upon the language proficiency. Because when you're in a group meeting, you can always turn to your side and ask, so what did he say? Is that what he said? But you can't do that in the meeting like this. So if there's anyone who can do that to translate, that would be rather helpful.
Okay, great. So here's a question that came in from one of our participants. When we look at virtual meetings, virtual trade shows, or networking events, sometimes Japanese people say they have a non-technical challenge. And that challenge is they're too shy to speak up or strike up a conversation. So other than Zoom nomikai, and I think we need a translation of that, speaking of needing translations, are there some examples to point to from Japan or Japanese companies doing interesting things to encourage participation from allegedly shy Japanese people?
Well, definition of shyness is subject to interpretation, right? Are they really shy? Are they really inward looking, so to speak? Or are they just cautious and careful not to make mistakes? And I would say that the vast majority of Japanese, of course, there are shy people among Americans in the same way. There are really shy people in Japan, but not the majority of them are. But then they want to make sure what they say is right and correct. So that's what they're, and they are like, they don't want embarrassment. You can laugh at yourself when you make mistakes, and I try to do that all the time when I make mistakes, but not everyone is good at doing that. So that cautiousness, not wanting to make mistakes, no embarrassment is part of the culture. Now, fermenting the atmosphere in which you feel more comfortable making mistakes here and there, not the egregious blunder, but the atmosphere to kind of enable you to accept whatever mistakes that you might make. Of course, there's this virtual nomikai. I'm not aware of any other things that the Japanese companies are trying to do, but nomikai is a drinks, right? When you are finished off with the job in the real world, you often go off to drink at izakaya and style, and you talk all kinds of things. So many Japanese are doing virtual nomikai or drinks after hours, and I was rather suspicious about it. And but then I've done it a few times, just two, three times, and it worked because you kind of cheers, toast, and start asking questions that you never feel comfortable asking. Like, what is your background? Mark, what is it? Your backdrop is beautiful. Where did you get it? Or there are some dogs barking or cats running around. So the beautiful cat, all these kind of things. And a previous night ago, I started to ask, I had this virtual nomikai with my Japanese business partners, so to speak, and started to ask about good Japanese restaurants that are open, or supermarkets that are good to go. All these exchange of information could be really helpful, as well as melting ice, breaking ice, and although I cannot really think of anything much else that has been going on, if you want to try it, it works.
That's really cool. I love that idea. We've done similar things at Institute for the Future where I've worked, where we have a kind of a Friday afternoon meeting occasionally, and we'll share a story. And the way that we do it is a little different than being live. And this is something that I experienced when I lived in Japan in the mid 80s. I worked in an English conversation lounge where Japanese people would come to practice their speaking skills. And after the first day, I really enjoyed it. After the first day of speaking with Japanese speakers who wanted to sharpen their English skills, she took me aside and she said, English conversation is like ping pong, and Japanese conversation is like bowling. And English speakers are happy to interrupt each other. It's more back and forth quickly. Japanese style conversation is more like bowling, where the person gets their turn to fully express an idea and expand on it. And then when they're finished, other people can take their turn to respond. And this is, we have a question that is very similar to this. The question came in. I worked in Japan for 6 months, and one of the most noticeable courtesies I noticed was colleagues not interrupting one another. How on Zoom calls do people contribute their thoughts and ideas while keeping the flow of the call going? That's a good question.
That's a very good question. And particularly when you have more than 5, 6 people in attendance, it's very hard. It takes courage to raise your hand or just to start speaking, interfering with someone else. And I don't think that we do have expression in Japanese like "let me finish," because no one interferes. I mean, very few people interfere with someone else's speaking, and that means that many people would stay silent. They want to say something, but they're hesitant because they don't want to interfere. They don't want to start talking at the same time with someone else. So I think that it's crucially important to get a good moderator, good chair, to prompt people to speak. It doesn't have to be one after another. It doesn't have to be in an orderly fashion, but it's good to have the good moderator to to do a little bit of homework beforehand and to see what they're good at, what their expertise are, what their responsibilities are, and then assign people to speak in rather orderly fashion. It can be still casual, but then if the person's mind is working constantly to ask someone to speak up.
I think that's a great idea, especially in very large Zoom meetings, to have a facilitator who singles out people and identifies them and says, you know, what do you have to say on this? It is much more orderly, it's less chaotic, and you'll find that your meetings are a lot more productive.
Exactly. And that relates to the other point that I made, to distribute your paper agenda, paper attendees in advance so that they can study it and they can prepare themselves.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So here's a question that I know comes up quite a bit in real life, but maybe there's a special way to handle this in Zoom. If someone says something in a meeting, either one of your colleagues or another company that you're doing business with, if they say something that you know is incorrect, what's the best way to correct this information? Like I imagine, like say my boss said something wrong and I know it's wrong. What's the best way to do that?
That's thank you for the difficult question because yeah, to that particular, and because it depends upon the circumstances as well. If you're among people that you know very well, you might be able to say straightforward, oh, I don't agree with you, sorry. Although even then you might want to say something nice like, oh, I see your point, but if I may correct one small point, or if it's a major point, of course you have to do that as well. But then as long as you use your diplomatic sense not to hurt the feelings of others, because as I said, no one wants embarrassment in front of the others. And because of that, of course, when you are prepared for the meeting, there will be less chances of making mistakes.
Right, that's good. Kind of the flip side of the coin, what's the best way to pay someone a compliment for doing good work?
Well, you just say whatever you say in English as if you were among your colleagues. Like, it's a great work. I really appreciate it, and you can't overemphasize it, your compliment. So, and they would appreciate it too. The more difficult part, of course, is when you don't agree. How do you express it? Because the way of expressing yourselves are different from culture to culture. So years ago, in 1989, there was a book, bestseller book called The Japan That Can Say No.
Mm-hmm.
Was co-authored by Akio Morita of Sony and Shintaro Ishihara, a renowned politician of Japan. They co-authored it because they wanted Japanese to speak up, to say no. You can say no when you have to say no. And it's still, I wouldn't say the same, but people are still struggling to say how to say no. So that's a cultural difference as well. And it's nice too, because you don't want to say square, flat no. But you have to get the message across. You want to understand, you want people to understand that you're saying no, rather than we think about it.
Right, or very difficult.
Right. So when I say, well, it's very difficult, I almost say, well, that's impossible. But you don't want to say that. So, well, I think about it, or I talk with my colleagues, but it could be rather difficult. And then later on, when we have individual meeting or email, might as well say, I'm sorry, but we cannot do this. Avoiding embarrassment is really consideration for others as well. So that's what can happen. And that makes it even more important to take note of the meetings, because you don't even want to ask, did you say yes or no? Did you mean no? Categoric? Right? And then you might leave the meeting and then discuss among your colleagues and say, she said, difficult, but think about it, right? So we do have 40% of 40% chances of getting yes. But if the other party meant really no in a very diplomatic way, the communications would not match. So I think that it's important to take notes and then share the notes with attendees, so that if it's no, if the person said that she would come back to them in a week, you take note of it and then start the conversation to follow up.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so we have another question from our viewers. This one is, my Japanese speaking is primarily casual. I know that business Japanese is a lot different, more formal, with different rules. Being a foreigner then, should I avoid trying to speak Japanese in a business setting, or would even trying be appreciated?
Well, I think that they would appreciate if the person speaks in English, probably at the outset, like say, introduce yourself in Japanese, and conclude with Japanese words.
Mm-hmm.
But I will not get in too deeply with the language that you don't feel necessarily comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
Not to be respectful or not to be diplomatic, but because of avoiding, you want to avoid misunderstanding. You want to make sure you understand it perfectly well. You want to make sure that everybody would understand what you're talking about. So if you don't if you haven't attained that level of proficiency, I recommend that you speak in English.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's see. Okay, here's another question that we have from Yusuke, and they ask, do you think keigo and age respect mannerism systems belong in creative meetings? I think age is not a factor in the level of one's creativity. Someone younger can come up with a better idea. I believe younger people can struggle to speak up with fear of seeming disrespectful. Proposing another idea may be seen as shutting that idea down. So this is, I guess, about seniority and kind of traditional respect for elders. It might keep people from speaking up with good ideas. Could you comment on that, Kaifu-san?
I think that it totally depends on the corporate culture of a company that you work at, because I cannot really speak on behalf of all of the companies. I know that there are rather traditional conservative companies that would follow this seniority system. But even then, I'm sure that good companies want to make sure that people, whoever the person it is, if the person has a great idea, creative idea, the company want to prompt these people to express their ideas, and that's what will sustain the success of the business. So, but then the way to do it would be different, right? They might appreciate lively discussions on the spot during the meeting, or they might invite those new ideas beforehand, so that there would be no surprise. Because you don't want to surprise your company president by saying something that is great, but contrary to what the company is trying to go forward. So so there are all different kinds of ways to prompt those. But then I guess that more Japanese companies are trying to accommodate and making the best use of young power, people who have new creative ideas.
Interesting. Okay, this is a great question. It's one that I have had myself, but have never really asked before, and it would be great to get clarity on it. Is it better to address Japanese people by adding san to the end of their name, or saying Mr., Miss, Ms.? What kind of honorific should be used?
Right. Well, of course, san is in place of Mr. or Miss or Mrs. And people who know about Japanese cultures, if they start calling me Yuko-san, I feel appreciative and feel that this person knows somewhat about the Japanese culture. or practice. Now, I don't usually recommend Japanese people to start addressing someone with san, because the person may have no idea about this san culture. So when you're okay, Mark san, because you've been, you know about Japanese culture.
Sure.
But someone who's not familiar with Japanese way of addressing people at all, like suddenly call the person by Mary-san. What is san, right? So once they get used to it, I think that it's a great idea to call san with san, but that's not a
Okay.
must. That's not really a necessity. Mm-hmm.
That's great to know. Okay, and so following up on that, and I imagine this depends on the context of the meeting, but is it okay to use the given name with san or the family name with san, which is preferred? So you know, do you mind if a Westerner calls you Yuko-san as opposed to Kaifu-san?
I'm fine either way, but I've probably been here too long. So I'm fine, and I tend to be more comfortable or feeling close to the person if the person calls me by my first name, Yuko-san, because it's it means that we're like friends, or we've known each other for quite some time. That kind of implication is there. Was Kaifu-san is more formal business setting. So when you go into a rather formal business meeting with your Japanese counterparts, unless they start calling you by your first name, I think that it probably would be safer to address people by their last name, either with Mr., Miss, or son. And then once things change, evolve, and you form a business partnership, and then people call others by their first names, then you might start calling Akira-san or whoever, so by their first names. So it's in the process of evolution too. And
Okay.
sorry, it also depends on the industry where you're in. I mean, if it's entrepreneurial, new high-tech or pop culture kind of industries, then people might start jumping in and start calling you by your first names immediately. So it depends.
Sure. That I could see that definitely in more creative industries where the dress is more casual and mannerisms, you could get away with that. So there are, you know, different kinds of honorifics other than san. There's kun, chan, sama. Is it best to just stick with san? Is that the safe bet, or do you sometimes need to use sama if it's somebody who's way up there on the hierarchy or chart?
Good question. But sama is basically for written document. When you address someone by sama, it really shows your high respect for the person, particularly if you are dealing with your customer, top person of the company that gives you a lot of work, and the person comes, and then you might start addressing the person by adding sama. But I think that unless you are a Japanese native speaker, it would be difficult to have it flow out naturally. So I would rather stick to san or Mr., Mrs., Dr., whatever the honorific. Kun, chan, if you make friends with your Japanese friends, really to get invited, to invite them to your home. I mean, after the pandemic is over, obviously. When you see small child, oh, Kenta-kun, or Ai-chan, how have you been? It's a very nice way of addressing those children. But unless you reach that stage of your relationship, it probably would not be appropriate in business settings.
Okay, that's good. Wow, this hour is moving by really quickly. I want to make sure I get another audience question in. This one is from Lucia. Lucia asks, is it considered disrespectful during a conference or class to have your microphone turned off? Which is the correct way to ask somebody politely to keep their children or dogs from interrupting? Sometimes it's an accident, but sometimes it might be very frequent.
True, true. I think that it's not disrespectful to turn your microphone, to turn off your microphone. And as a matter of fact, at the beginning of a meeting, the chair of the moderator of the meeting asked people to mute their speakers, simply because it creates, if you mute, if everybody else is on unmute, then it can cause technical issue of not keeping the sound clear. So that's part of the protocol for virtual meeting. Now, I don't think that it's disrespectful to turn your microphone off while others are speaking. It makes sense. I would rather not leave my seats during the speeches while others are speaking, because that might be seen as something, okay, she's not interested in my talk. So that's not, I don't recommend that. But in terms of muting your microphone is quite acceptable, and as a matter of fact, recommended. What's the second question that you said?
Let's see. Oh, the correct way to ask someone politely to keep their children or dogs from interrupting.
That's right. That happens all the time, particularly when we are working from home. And I was worried if the cars sound on the street might interfere, but I'm glad that it's been relatively quiet this morning. But you can politely say that, because sometimes, more often than not, you don't know whose dogs it is, right? Whose children that is making sound. So I see barking of I see dogs. I can hear dogs. Can you? Because you don't have to identify the person, and the person knows that it's your dog. So it would be better if you don't want to just, okay, Mark. So without doing that, I guess that can be done politely.
That's good. That's good. This is a great question from a participant, because one of the things that I really enjoyed and was so much fun was exchanging business gifts at meetings. So how is the Japanese tradition of presenting business gifts at meetings going to change now that so many of these meetings are virtual? Is there a way you can get around this and send something in advance or after the meeting? What can we do about this?
Well, that's a great question, because I miss those as well. I mean, not on the recipient side necessarily, but for a person who travels to Japan, having business meeting, to kind of select whatever people might like cookies or chocolates or wine. That's the fun part of it. But of course, we have to miss that. And I don't think that it's necessary to exchange business gifts after or prior to the meeting. I think that you might want, if you really want to show your appreciation, you might want to save it up for the Christmas gift with a nice card, and then send it, ship it with the note of your appreciation. They will get it, because otherwise, I mean, they might be caught by surprise, and they might start wondering, okay, what should we get in return? So it's almost business gift exchange, repeat after another. So I don't recommend necessarily, unless you really want to do that. Yeah, doing it with Christmas will be probably better.
Yeah, well, that is a great idea. Just one quick final question before we're over. I can't believe it's already over. What about humor and sarcasm? Is that okay to use in traditional meetings as well as Zoom meetings? Talk a little bit about that. I'm sure that, again, you'll say there's context is important, but I'm sure you'll have an interesting perspective on this.
Humor to make people laugh is always good, virtual, in person, whatever, as long as people do understand. So, and then Japanese people know in the US or elsewhere in the world, people do treasure making jokes at the beginning of the speech, or throw in your humor here and there. And I think that people appreciate it. So I recommend, and it would be a nice icebreaker again as well, as long as they get it.
Right. Well, Kaifu-san, I cannot believe we are out of time. Thank you so much for all your time and insights. This has really been an interesting discussion for me, and I'm sure for all of our listeners too. I'm
Thank you.
sure we've all enjoying learning about Japanese style business culture and conversation. I'm really sorry to our participants that we weren't able to answer all of the questions, but we have recorded this conversation and we'll be posting it online soon. So you can follow Japan House LA on social media for updates. Just do search, Google is your friend. You can find all of Japan House's social media, or if you go to Japan House Los Angeles's website, you'll be able to find links there. Following this webinar, we'll be sending you a survey. So thank you in advance for giving us your feedback on this. And again, thank you so much, Kaifu-san. Thanks to everyone for joining, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. And have a great day, everybody.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's been fun. Thank you so much.
It really has been. Thank you.